Thank you for joining us for another edition of the Florida Chamber's Bottom Line. I'm Edie Owsley, Vice President of Public Affairs, and joining us today is Eric Eggers, author of Fraud. And Eric is going to talk about his book, which really details how the left plans to steal the next election. Eric, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Edie. It's great to be here.
So, Eric, you just released a new book that burst open the ballot box and exposes voter fraud. Can you tell us a little bit about the details of the book and what readers will learn from it?
Yeah, thanks, Edie. As you mentioned, I work for the Government Accountability Institute, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank located in Tallahassee. And we focus on federal government issues. And we've heard so much talk about this idea of voter fraud. Is it a problem? Is it not? And we believe in the mantra of show, don't tell. So we want to take a look and see what the actual evidence said. So we gathered as many publicly available voter rolls as we could get, which ended up being 21 states worth of data. We hired an expert to help us sort through that data. And then we contracted with a commercial database that's used to detect EBT fraud and things of that nature. And what we found was stunning. We found what appeared to be 2,100 cases of double voting in the state of Florida alone. Edie, what that means is that 2,100 times somebody would have had to cast a ballot in the state of Florida and then cast the second ballot in a different state. And while that may seem outrageous, it's actually not improbable when you consider the fact that there's nearly 3 million people in this country that are registered to vote in more than one state. The Supreme Court cited statistics that said 24 million voter registrations, that's nearly 1 in 8, are significantly flawed or completely inaccurate. So we know that there's vulnerabilities that allow for the 2,100 double votes in Florida to exist.
So you focus on the 2,100 other votes. For those of us who can remember the 2000 presidential election, Gore versus Bush, that would have been a real big game changer. How does the book detail that?
Well, that's exactly right. You know, one of the dominant narratives you hear from people that want to deny that voter fraud is a real problem is this idea that it can't happen on a scale that's significant enough to swing an election. And as we discovered, 2,100 votes is nearly 4 times the margin of victory of the presidential election in this century, which was in 2000. We all remember the hanging chads and the recount from 2000. So right away we said, well, clearly it can happen at a significant level, and further research only validated that perspective.
One of the chapters of your book is called George Soros, the man behind the ballot box. That brings images of other organizations like Acorn to mind. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know that George Soros becomes a little bit of this kind of conservative boogeyman. It's a conspiracy theory. Well, there's nothing conspiratorial about the amount of money he spent to do 2 things that keep American elections vulnerable to voter fraud. On the one hand, he funds groups that are very litigious. They file lawsuits at every turn to stop states from trying to make their elections more secure. The state of Ohio recently had to fight against Soros-funded efforts to implement their voter ID law and to cleanse their voter rolls of illegal voters. At the same time, though, George Soros funds other organizations like, as you mentioned, Acorn or La Raza, that then go out and gather as many voters as possible and funnel them through the vulnerable gaps that the other groups have fought to make sure exist, whether or not these voters are actually legally able to cast a ballot. So it is kind of a 1-2 punch that ultimately only ends up impacting American voters.
Let's bring it a little closer to home and focus on Florida. We certainly know that Florida has had its fair share of issues, and one that immediately comes to mind is granny farming. Tell me a little bit about how your book, Fraud, relates to Florida's experiences.
Yeah, so even people that think that voter fraud's not a huge problem would admit that the vulnerable populations, or the populations that are the most vulnerable to voter fraud, are the senior citizens. And as we all know, Florida has an abundance of senior citizens in our state. And so what granny farming is a term that refers to the manner in which vulnerable senior citizens are preyed upon by these Soros-funded groups that go out and they cultivate relationships with these senior citizens, or they identify these populations, these residential facilities, or these other areas in which there's large amounts of vulnerable seniors. And then they harvest the votes. They help them fill out absentee ballot request forms, and then they're there when the absentee ballots come in, and oftentimes they manipulate the outcomes, or they actually just fill out the ballots on behalf of the senior citizens. And the worst part about this is it's totally legal. There was actually a woman who was found in South Florida who had a notebook on her which detailed thousands of payments between campaigns throughout the state and the senior citizens that she was working on behalf of. And actually, one of the reasons why she ended up not being charged with very much of a legal penalty is because one of the women whose ballot she had harvested actually died before charges could be filed. So, that's a very real practice and something that all Floridians should be concerned about.
Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. To our viewers, remember the name of the book is Fraud, and it's by Eric Eggers of Tallahassee, Florida. I highly encourage you to go out and get a copy and take a good read of this book. And for more information on how you can get a copy of it, there's information on the screen. To you, our viewers, thank you so much for joining us on another edition of the Florida Chamber's Bottom Line.